Welcome to Free Kiwis, and today we're greatly honoured to welcome Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan is Professor of Ethical Leadership at the New York Stern School of Business. He's also the author of a number of quite well-read books, The Happiness Hypothesis, The Righteous Mind, and more recently, The Coddling of the American Mind, which is something we'll discuss in some detail today. He's also one of the founders of the Heterodox Academy, and for listeners who may not know what that is, it's an international organisation of university staff concerned with viewpoint diversity on campuses. And there's an interesting story about that actually, which is that a few years ago when John was visiting New Zealand, he organised a small meeting of local members of the Heterodox Academy, and there turned out to be two in Wellington, one of them myself and the other my co-host James. So if it wasn't for John, in fact, Free Kiwis may not exist. So thank you for that, John.
I'm thrilled to hear that.
Now, perhaps it would be good to start with the Heterodox Academy and a bit of a survey of why you decided that that was a good thing to do.
So I've been studying political polarization. So first, I'm a social psychologist and I study moral psychology and how it varies across cultures. And my original work was how morality varies across like nations and cultures. But in the United States, the culture war began getting so bad in the 90s and early 2000s that I began studying how left and right were like different nations. And then it began getting so bad that it began affecting social science research, because we're almost all on the left. Artists are on the left, sociologists, anthropologists. There are a lot of fields that are on the left. That's not necessarily a problem. But around like 2008, 2010, and there, it began to feel like there was a new orthodoxy coming in and that we couldn't have the normal discussions we used to have. And if social scientists can't challenge each other, because if you question something, you'll be, shamed or called names, well, then the whole project of social science or science more generally fails. We can't do it unless we can expect critique from our peers. And so I wrote a paper on this with 5 other social psychologists titled something like Viewpoint Diversity Will Make Social Psychological Science Better. And then that paper ultimately turned into Heterodox Academy because I found out that there were similar papers written recently by a law professor and a sociology grad student. And so the 3 of us got together and said, hey, wow, this is a problem affecting the whole academy. We're talking 2015 now. It wasn't really so bad in 2008, let's say, but by 2015, it was getting really bad. And so we just bought the domain name Heterodox Academy, which is the opposite of Orthodox Academy, just means variety as opposed to uniformity. And then right after we launched in September of 2015, all hell broke loose on American college campuses, beginning at Halloween. And we just had a series of events. You may not have followed them in New Zealand, but just blow-ups over little tiny things, an email, a word used in an announcement. And so the situation began to get quite dire in the United States. That's what led us to found Heterodox Academy. And at first we thought it was just an American problem. And then it became clear, well, actually, the exact same thing is happening in Canada and the UK. And I didn't know about Australia, New Zealand. And I had the great good fortune to travel around Australia, New Zealand with Think Inc., a company that brings great speakers down to Australia, New Zealand. And Susie arranged talks at various universities, in Auckland and a few in Australia. And then I guess we met. Oh yes, I spoke at like a think tank in Wellington, I think.
Yes, the New Zealand Initiative. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Yes. And then as long as I was there, I think I'd emailed all the Heterodox Academy members that were in New Zealand, and the 2 of you, I think we had a lovely tea in a little quiet hotel restaurant or something like that.
Yeah.
And here we are.
That's right. Yes. So since then, things have arguably got a bit more serious even than they were then. And perhaps a good way into that would be for me to perhaps summarize what I see as the important points from the Coddling of the American Mind. And see where that might take us in terms of a conversation about what's happening now. I mean, my reading of that book is that you're really looking at a growth in fragility in young people, which you hypothesize two causes for. One is a kind of overprotective approach to parenting over the last few decades, and the other is the rise in the popularity of social media and the kind of effect that has on young people's discourse. And you have these sort of three great untruths that you refer to in the book, which perhaps we could see as at worst a shift in values that might underpin the kinds of changes we've been seeing. One is turning on its head Nietzsche's maxim that what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And in fact, the maxim has become what doesn't kill me makes me weaker. In other words, I can't stand anything that challenges me or makes me feel in any way, to coin the phrase, unsafe. And another is putting too much trust in feelings at the expense of reason. And the third is that life is some kind of Manichaean battle between good and evil, and that people can be divided into those two camps. Now, when I put those three things together, it seems to me that what we get is the antithesis of the sorts of values that led to science and the Enlightenment and the free exchange of ideas. And one of the things that James and I have discussed at some length in recent times is whether this shift actually is the beginnings of a kind of revolution in values that could sweep away the things that we greatly value, the ability to freely discuss ideas, the project launched in the Enlightenment for scientific understanding and so on. We'd be very interested, especially since you are also a scholar of religious psychology, on your take on that.
Certainly, this is the challenge of our time. Well, there are many challenges of our time, but understanding the sociology, the new trends that are making people afraid to speak, and that are in a sense breaking down the institutions built up over the last few hundred years that have given us science and institutionalized disconfirmation. So let's start. Yes, those three great untruths. So my first book was called The Happiness Hypothesis. And I basically just read all the ancient works I could find. And they made a lot of claims about chemistry and physics that were completely false. There's no need to read them. But they also made a lot of claims about consciousness, relationships, happiness, human nature. And boy, were they good. It's not that they were smarter than us, but they said a lot of things, and only the works that really resonated with generation after generation got passed down to us. So we have a kind of a, quintuple filtered mechanism for getting the best thought of the ancient world. And so the happiness hypothesis surveys 10 of these ideas. And, one of them is what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, as Nietzsche put it, because we are anti-fragile. We actually need disorder, challenge, even some fear. We need to get lost sometimes. Kids need to get lost. But we don't let that happen anymore because we're afraid. We think that will damage them. So for a variety of reasons that Greg Lukianoff and I go into in the book, at least in the United States, we really changed the way we raise kids in the 1990s. Before then, kids went out and played, as I think they still do in New Zealand. Just a little aside, New Zealand seems to be the last English-speaking country that lets children climb trees. Even in Australia, when I was there, they were doing a lot more of the overprotection, but it seemed to me that New Zealand was much better. And so I would predict that your rugby teams will, in 5 or 10 years, be dominating the world. But anyway, yes, we started grossly overprotecting our kids, which impedes their development. They don't learn their limits. They don't extend their limits. And then at the same time, that same generation got social media. This is Gen Z or Gen Z, born in 1996 and later. So what hit us at universities around 2014 is that we had Gen Z coming in around 2013, 2014, and they were much more fragile, much more depressed, much more ready to believe some ideologies that say that everything is good versus evil. everything is power structures, everything is exploitation. No matter how, there's been no progress in 50 years. No matter what you do, if you're a woman, you will be paid 78% of what a man makes for the same work, which is completely untrue. But yet, I've even heard social scientists say that in the United States. So for a variety of reasons, we've created a generation that is fragile and depressed. But here's why I'm not. Here's why I'm perhaps more optimistic than you. Um, what's going on with attitudes is not that this generation has turned against free speech or the principles of a free society. If you look at the survey evidence, if you look at national surveys in the United States, it's not that they have dropped their support for free speech. It's that it's two things. It's one, they've greatly raised their concern about groups that would be offended, especially African Americans. That any sort of speech that offends people, that should be stopped. So yes, I support free speech unless it offends, quote, marginalized communities. Um, so, but most members of Gen Z are quite reasonable. They know that they have problems with fragility and depression. They want to be stronger. They want to learn. So I don't think we're seeing these vast hordes of young crazy snowflakes. We're seeing a generation that's in trouble, and we're seeing a big change in dynamics so that what we see is not reflective of the average person anywhere. What we're seeing is the extremes greatly empowered by social media. So this isn't a question of how do we convince, billions of people or millions of people to change their mind. Is how do we change parameters so that the small number of, I mean, the word is woke, a small number of woke students can't intimidate everyone into silence.
Yes, I see what you mean. I guess one reservation I have about what you're saying is that a belief in free speech, except when it offends, is probably not really a belief in free speech.
No, that's right.
That's one issue. And the other concern I have is that while I completely agree that this is not being led by a majority, I worry that it doesn't take a majority to change a culture when the majority is actually silenced. And I mean, James would know more about this as a scholar of ancient history, but we might think back to when Christianity overran the Roman Empire and what the 4th century AD, is that when it all happened?
Constantine made it the official religion in the 4th century.
And it wasn't as if at the time most people were Christians in the Roman Empire, but then within a few decades, this new set of values swept across everything.
Right, and it gets on to something else I wanted to ask John, which is, I think whatever way you tell that story of the Christianization of the Roman Empire, one of the things that's going on there is this moral authority, that there were these great pagan schools of philosophy, and they're very sophisticated intellectuals, and this new thing came in, and a lot of them just thought it was complete bunk. They thought these guys are crazy, it's this sort of Eastern mystery religion, but it kept growing, and I think one of the reasons it kept growing is because of this idea that they had this moral authority, especially after various persecutions. And this is something that strikes me very much about this, whatever you want to call it, woke movement, that you can chip away at some of their claims, and as you say, some of them don't seem very empirically grounded, but for whatever reason, they seem to have gained this moral authority. And I say for whatever reason, because to me it's a bit bemusing, because you see, people's careers being ruined on Twitter over some minor thing they've said. And it doesn't seem very, very morally enlightened to me. But there are various ways in which they present themselves as the heir to various civil rights movements. And, if you go back a few decades, of course, and to a certain extent it's still true today, there were these marginalized groups and they had a tougher time. So they're latching on to that. So I guess my question is, when we're sort of arguing against this movement, is there a strategic problem here? Because the strategy, the arguments that you take in the Coddling the American Mind, which I think are broadly right, it's very easy for them to come across as somehow a bit mean, right? It almost sounds like, I know you're not saying this, but it can sound as if we're saying, oh, just sort of buck up, stiff upper lip, that kind of thing. Is that a problem?
Right. That is something that people sometimes say, but let's look at the nature of social change here. Of course, social change is often good. Societies have to adapt. And when social movements win by persuasion or by winning people over, well, that's great. That's what should happen in a democracy. It's not that everything needs to be civil all the time and people need to be nice all the time. But the civil rights movement didn't win by intimidating and making everyone afraid to speak. Christianity, as far as I know, didn't win through intimidation of Romans. It won them over. Martin Luther King made the choice to go with love, not hate. Malcolm X had a very different view, and in a diverse and somewhat polarized democracy, the more you hate the other side and beat on them, the stronger they get. Whereas the way to win is by love and showing a better way. Any group that wins that way deserves to win. But what we're seeing with the woke movement is that it 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 has very much the form of a religion, and specifically the Christian religion, or the Protestant version of Christianity. It's very Protestant, except without any of the good parts.
No
There's
redemptive
no
mechanism.
That's right. There's no redemption, no grace, no hope, no chance of change. Um, just original sin and good versus evil sort of thing. So let's just okay. So let's back up a little bit on the religion. Let me just explain in what way it is religion, and then we'll get to that objection that are we just saying, oh, minorities should just be grateful or get with the program. So how is it religion? So in The Righteous Mind, the subtitle is Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And a lot of the book it's both evolution and it's cultural psychology. And the evolutionary piece is that we evolved to be tribal, we evolved to be groupish, not selfish. And the key innovation for human beings that makes us ultra social is sacredness. So there are many ultra social species, naked mole rats, bees, ants, termites, there's some spiders. But in all cases, they do it by having a queen who lays all the eggs. And so they're all literally siblings. Humans are the only ultra social creatures that do our ultra sociality, our gigantic communities like cities, without having to be siblings. And we do it because you first always find temples. You find civilization is always preceded by temples or ziggurats or pyramids. And so we make something sacred and then we circle around it. And part of proving that you are a member of the community is believing obviously false things. And this is why faith is so important in miracles. So we evolved for religion, and there was a temporary period from 2000 BC to maybe 2000 or 2005 or something like that, in which big religions dominated. But now big religions are fading out very quickly. And in the United States, by far the fastest growing religious answer is spiritual but not religious. And that's especially on the left. And what that means is if we have, as Pascal said, a God-shaped hole in our hearts. That's a paraphrase. He didn't say exactly that, but he did say something to that effect. We evolved for God, I believe. And if you don't have an actual, I mean, if you don't have like, Christian God or Hindu gods, or if we don't have gods that evolved culturally over thousands of years, you've got this big hole that can be filled with almost anything. And so, rugby can become like a religion. People can, fraternities, rock star, rock fandom. We're a deeply religious species. And as we've entered this age of extraordinary anomie, which means normlessness, as all the old knowledge and certainty and shared meanings have been shattered and shredded, there's a gigantic openness, especially for non-religious people. And that means especially young people on the left who are less likely to be religious in the old sense. And so when ideas of social justice, influenced especially by Michel Foucault, who said everything is power, there is no objective truth. Words make reality, and whoever's in power makes the reality. Um, those ideas had been percolating since the 1980s. I'm just reading now Helen Pluckrose's wonderful book, Cynical Theories, that really explains it in the way that you can understand. So when these theories that have been in universities since the 80s but they were kind of, kept in the studies departments, gender studies, race studies, that sort of thing. Well, in the 2010s, as social media knocked down the walls between everything, so there's no containment of anything anymore. All of society is just one giant Twitterverse or something. These terrible ideas that everything is power met up with this new generation that was anxious and depressed, met up with this new social media environment. And what you have is what we call in the United States the Great Awokening. So we used to have these great awakenings, these religious revivals of Protestantism in the 17th century and 18th century, especially. And it's been discovered that around 2015, something happened to white liberals. And again, liberal in the American sense of just leftist, progressive. Something happened to white leftists. They shift way to the left on matters of race, gender, and immigration. It's very sudden. It's right in 2015, give or take like 1 year. And you see this all over the place. In the New York Times, if you just do word analysis of like power structures and social justice, things like that. So something weird happened. It's a sociological transition point in the United States in 2015, very similar in Canada and the UK. And I think it was a little delayed in Australia and New Zealand. A lot of our bad ideas, they cross the Atlantic Ocean pretty quickly to Britain, but they take a little longer to get to you down under. So anyway, that's my analysis and Greg Lukianov's analysis. It's a very Durkheimian analysis of how we're religious creatures, and wokeness is a religion, and it's a very bad religion because it hasn't evolved over millennia. It's brand new, and it's very cruel and inconsistent.
So do you think those bad features of it will save us from it in a reasonably short amount of time, or are we headed for a real civilizational conflict and disaster? I mean, it seems to me there are a couple of features of it that give me cause for some optimism, because they do seem so bad that it can't take root. One is that lack of a redemptive mechanism, and the other is that, unlike Christianity, which is ultimately unifying in that it wants to treat everybody the same under God, wokeness, for want of a better term, is founded on divisiveness, and therefore won't serve the function that a religion needs to serve, as you said, to unify a culture.
Well, a religion can serve to unify a culture against another culture. The best way to unify people is a foreign attack, or we've got to come together to fight off the devil, or some sort of existential threat. So religion can unify in that way, and I think all the major monotheistic religions have done that at times. But I am optimistic for this reason. The ideas are so bad and so divorced from reality that when they are brought to people, almost everybody hates them. And so the group More in Common, this wonderful UK-based group, does amazing survey work. More in Common, they put out, just go to moreincommon.org, I think it is. They put out all kinds of surveys showing that of the 7 tribes in America, 7 different psychological profiles, only one, the progressive activists, think that, basically think that, I forget what the exact questions are, but they're the only ones who seem receptive to woke ideas. Everybody else, including most people on the left, don't like them. They don't like political correctness. They don't like being told what they can and can't say. And so what we're finding is, even though this the sort of the woke, or critical race, critical CRT, critical race theory, or critical social justice, even though it's able to overtake nonprofits and companies and schools very quickly, it doesn't win people's hearts. It wins by fear. And so that's what we're seeing now in New York City. Just in the last 2 months, we're seeing a lot of our elite private schools, these very expensive high schools, that are very progressive, and in their mission statements, they're clearly progressive on the left. They commit themselves, after George Floyd was killed last year, many of them committed themselves to anti-racism, which sounds like a good thing. It's good to be against racism, but anti-racism is a very particular doctrine. Ibram Kendi is the current spokesman for it. It's a very particular doctrine that says that if you're not at this moment actively trying to create racial equity, which means equal outcomes, then you are racist. Everything that isn't actively doing what I say they should do is racist. And almost everybody when exposed to this, like, what? You mean, if I'm watching my kid's soccer game, or if we're having a PT, a town meeting about water fountains, that's racist. Um, it's bizarre stuff, and almost everybody hates it, but they're afraid to speak up. Well, this can only go so far, and especially so in our private schools now in New York City and in California, parents are finally speaking out. Now they often speak out anonymously because they're afraid, but they will publish letters saying how crazy this stuff is and how their kids come home crying, and how you're not teaching we're paying you all this money. My kids aren't learning anything. They're told everything is always about race, which it obviously is not. So the revolution, or I should say that the reaction against this craziness has begun in 2021. It wasn't there in 2020 at all, but it really is beginning, because this stuff is unsustainable. And things can change very quickly. It's a complex dynamical system. And if certain parameters change, you can get out of one attractor space, like one sort of hole. You can get out of one and sort of over a hill and down into a better valley. So I'm actually optimistic. Things have gotten so bad in the USA that I think they're going to change.
Can I just pick you up, because you said something very interesting there about kids coming home from school and crying. And I wonder if I could just bring you back to the coddling of the American mind in particular. I know this is written with Greg Lukianoff, who has a special concern for cognitive behavioral therapy. Because I think that, I said before that it can seem that your book is sort of mean, but I think in fact, even though you criticize this generation in some ways, your overriding concern here is to try and help them, right? Because
yes.
there does seem to be evidence that they have, shall we say, less resilience, so they're having more mental health problems. So what, in your opinion, does the evidence show about how students can actually develop resilience and lessen depression and anxiety?
Mm-hmm. Well, so the first thing is that we have to delay kids getting on social media. By social media, I mean anything where they put content out and then it's evaluated by others. So especially Instagram. I think kids shouldn't be on it till they're 16. They certainly shouldn't be on it below 13, and they almost all are, because the platforms don't make any effort to stop that. So that's one thing that has to change. But more relevant to our conversation is that kids, we have to be teaching and modeling for kids that in order to grow, they've got to face difficulties and challenges. And the more we protect them from it, the weaker they get. What that means is that if we have schools in which everyone is trying to protect members of, quote, marginalized groups, which means all the women, African Americans, Latinos, LGBTQ, that's like 80% of the school. And the white boys come home saying, Mom, everyone, I'm supposed to say that I'm supposed to identify as white, me personally, I never identified as white. I identified as Jewish. Like, it would be weird to say when I was a kid, like, I as a white person, like, what? But kids are being forced to say, no, your identity is white. You're white, and white is bad. Like, whoa, that is the best possible way to push the white boys over to like neo-Nazis who are recruiting them online.
That's what worries me.
That's right. So in so many ways, wokeness does exactly the opposite of what it professes to do. It certainly doesn't work as a way to bring about racial equity or justice. But again, I'm sorry to return. There's so many threads here that we could follow out. But to return to the main line here, I think what we're beginning to see is that it backfires in that the white kids the white boys especially, are sort of beat on. They actually might come out stronger, whereas everybody else comes out with more of a victim mentality. So this is really hurting the very people it's supposed to help. And so I'll just read my favorite quotes from the book, because there are a lot of older African Americans who went through the civil rights movement and who see how crazy this is, how disempowering this is. So here's a quote from Van Jones, who is he's a Democratic activist. He was in the Obama administration. He's a commentator on CNN. He's really brilliant and great at crossing over and talking to all kinds of people. So he gave a talk at the University of Chicago, and the host asked him what he thought about students' demands for safe spaces. And here's what he said. He said, after acknowledging, yeah, if people are, calling you the N-word or they're physically attacking you, of course you should be safe from that. But if we're talking about ideas here, he says, quote, I don't want you to be safe ideologically. I don't want you to be safe emotionally. I want you to be strong. That's different. I'm not going to pave the jungle for you. Put on some boots and learn how to deal with adversity. I'm not going to take all the weights out of the gym. That's the whole point of the gym. This is the gym. So, the subtitle of our book is How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Wokeness has some ideas to it, and it has some good motives, but it's based on really, really bad psychology. So to the extent that this is implemented on kids, it's going to hurt the girls, the African Americans. It's going to hurt them the most in the name of protecting them.
Yeah. I was smiling when you were reading that quote because, in fact, I presented it in a series of lectures I gave recently to, we're actually in a program that we've put in place for kids who come out of school without the qualifications, normal qualifications to get into university. And I've been running that over the last trimester. And so one of the things, in fact, you and your book featured in that series as well. And I have to say it gave me some cause for optimism because my objective with that series was not so much to deal with the academic matters, which were dealt with by others, but really to try to build that resilience to ideas and to prepare them for the discourse that universities ought to, at any rate, to foster. And it was very well received, and that actually gave me some cause for optimism because I wasn't cancelled and they didn't react against what I was saying at all. I didn't stray into territory that was, likely to cause a great deal of controversy as regards, the trans issues or the race issues and this kind of thing. But in terms of that groundwork of the free exchange of ideas and a bit of robustness to disagreement, and we did some exercises where they were encouraged to disagree in the spirit of trying to get to a better truth. It went pretty well. So, and this is against a backdrop definitely of depression, anxiety. We dealt with a couple of attempted suicides during that program. So it's not as if things are rosy for them. They're not, but they did react well to that sense that things could be better if they, could develop a bit more resilience. So.
That's wonderful to hear. And that also illustrates the point that most people are reasonable. And if you speak to a large audience, many of us are, and leaders of almost everything seem to be afraid because somebody will get mad at them or say something bad on Twitter about them. But yet, if you survey the whole audience, especially if you do it privately, or anonymously, you usually find tremendous support for this position because most people realize, talking to people is generally good for you. And if you disagree, it can be good for you. And kids aren't snowflakes. They're not going to die if they are exposed to a cartoon from 30 years ago. So yeah, again, this gives me hope. When I've spoken to many audiences of high school students and college students who are all Gen Z, and I always ask at the end of the talk, I've just said some things that are pretty negative about your generation. Do you think I largely got this right or wrong? And the vote is almost always 100% to 0% that they agree, that they're not in denial at all. They know that they have huge problems with mental health and they want help. But help usually means, we'll give you more therapists and we'll give you more, more protections. Like, no, treat them like human beings, like human, young humans who have been denied what they most need to grow. Give them what they need to grow.
Another point is, I went to cognitive behavioral therapy, I think like Greg Lukianoff, and it's interesting because the evidence-based help, the help that's most grounded in evidence seems to be this thing where it's not to say that you don't have a problem. It's just to say that a lot of the emotions you're experiencing are normal emotions. And it seems like there's a lot of evidence in particular that we should avoid avoidance. In other words, you have a challenge, maybe it kicks in your fight or flight response and your tendency is to think, I can't face this. A lot of evidence that's the worst thing to do, to actually follow that inclination. And so instead, what we should be training people to do is just face up to these fears. And then 9 times out of 10, you realize it's not as bad as a certain part of your brain was telling you. And then you realize you have a capacity for these things, you can actually cope with them, and you
Exactly.
grow in that way.
Exactly. So my kids they're kind of fed up with my lectures and my constantly talking about this stuff. My kids are 11 and 14 now. But about 4 or 5 years ago, when I would read with my daughter in bed every night, and we'd read stories, and we were reading something, and there was a scary part, and she said, "No, no, stop, stop." And then she thought about it, and she said, "No, continue, continue." Because she knew that it's by encountering things like this that she'll get stronger.
Yeah.
And then, to her credit, she and her best friend they actually started watching horror movies, but starting with like gentle ones and like moving up. And the same thing when we go to Coney Island, the big amusement park in New York City. So, kids who understand that they actually need to test the limit. And look, almost all kids actually understand this instinctively. If you give kids skateboards, they're going to start skateboarding, but pretty soon, once they've mastered that, they're going to try to figure out how to like skateboard down a staircase, or the kids are dosing themselves with risk, as Peter Gray says, a psychologist who studies play in children. So yeah, free play, including risk, is essential for kids' growth.
So can I bring you just back one final time, at the risk of annoying you, to this objection? So because it seems to me that you've probably encountered this with parents, right? You're saying, let your children play in the trees, let them be exposed to peanuts when they're young, because it actually helps them not develop peanut allergies. And at a certain point, I'm sure you've encountered the objection, well, but climbing trees is dangerous. There's probably a certain amount of evidence that 0.01% of people climbing trees fall out and they have a horrible accident. And this is a conversation we have all the time. I mean, you've mentioned rugby a couple of times, the sort of national religion of New Zealand. And it's something that people are talking about right now, of course, because there's more and more evidence that, concussions are a serious thing. Should we let our children play rugby, et cetera? So there is a line somewhere, isn't there, with things that are genuinely dangerous. So is there any kind of rule of thumb that you have for what's genuinely dangerous, or you just have to look at it on a case-by-case basis?
Here are two rules of thumb. One is that zero risk is a terrible thing to aim for, because that will deny kids what they need to grow. The next rule is this safety thing that you're talking about going to just make them safer, or is it going to prevent them from having experiences? So they should definitely wear helmets when they ride. You should think about safety. If you're sending your kid on a long trip, there's a debate as to whether kids should have cell phones with them when they're 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. Lenore Skenazy, who wrote Free Range Kids, thinks no, they should be totally on their own as they were. But I actually think parents are more likely to let them out if they know that they can call if they get in trouble. So it's fine. It's good to think about safety, but you have to also think about safety and maximize them in their experience. So they have to maximize safety and experiences. Whereas what we began doing in the 1990s was safety uber alles. If there's any risk, then we're going to totally cut that out. But all you have to do is counterpose the risk the other way. Let's say there's a point, if you let kids climb trees during recess or whatever, there's a 0.01% chance that a kid will get hurt seriously. Or maybe it's a 1%. Call it 1%. That's pretty big. Wow, that sounds scary. 1 in 100? We can't do that. Well, but what's the other side? Suicide rates have doubled. Suicide rates are going way, way up. And not just suicide, self-harm, a life of depression. And what are we talking about here? 1%, 2%? No. Of the girls, 30 or 40%. So it's unbelievable what has happened to kids' mental health. So put that on one side of the scale, and then you can talk to me about a 0.01% chance.
Yeah, we forget the long-term risks, or we don't take account of the long-term risks to, in the case of suicide, life, and at least to mental health. And I guess that part of that is because it's a much more diffuse risk over time rather than the acute risk of falling out of a tree and breaking a limb or whatever.
Yeah.
But
that's certainly true.
What you said before about your daughter and stories, it seems to me is a really important part of it as well. I also have two daughters a little younger than you, and the older of them has, for whatever reason, always had a hunger for scary stories. She was into Hansel and Gretel when she was 3 or 4. She wanted to hear about the witch that wanted to eat the children, and she's got this children's version, well, young person's version of Dracula, which she loves as well, the vampires, and that gives me great joy to see her getting into that, because it seems to me that stories, I mean, there's no physical risk to reading a story, and it's hard to imagine that there's really any serious psychological risk either. And
No,
and so it's a good
just the
way to
opposite.
be exposed to these themes of death and danger, and perhaps, you know, because we are such narrative creatures, that's part of the solution as well, is through exposure to horror
Yep.
in fiction.
If you want to go
That
really
is
crazy, you could read Homer and Ovid as well. Which,
Oh, we better have a trigger warning for that.
She's done the Iliad and Odyssey, or at least children's versions thereof. So.
No, that's beautiful. And just to build on what you said, human, we have these gigantic brains that have to get filled in by experience. We have what's called experience expectant development. And the brain, there's some general, the genes started on a path of development, but it needs a lot of input in order to grow. And dealing with risk, learning to calculate risk for yourself is one of the most important survival skills, especially for an omnivorous species like ours that had to seize opportunities as well as recoiling from threats. So how do you get all this massive experience? Well, you could try to get all the experience yourself, but you'll probably get eaten along the way. Better to immerse yourself in a world of stories. Of course, you need experience yourself, but you can consume 100 times more stories than you can direct experience. And that's what makes great literature great.
Yeah.
It brings you into the complexities of life. So, when you're 7, 8, 9, you don't need great literature. You can have cartoons. But especially once you hit puberty, you're in high school and college, that's what a liberal arts education should really be about. Is exposure to complexity. And almost nobody is purely good or purely evil. And this is why the Russian novelists are so great. It's so morally complex. And what we have going on now in our schools is an effort to purify. So we certainly are going to get rid of any author who, ever said anything that can be interpreted as racist. But in the United States, we're getting rid of any author who used the N-word, even if it was in an anti-racist way. So probably, very few kids are ever going to read Mark Twain's work anymore, because he talks about the pre-Civil War South,
Joseph Conrad.
Joseph Conrad, or To Kill a Mockingbird. And so in every way, again, if you just look at what the woke movement wants to do, pretty much always, no, I shouldn't say, well, most of the time, whatever they want to do, if you look carefully, you'll see that it's going to hurt kids. It's going to hurt people. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. We should be ramping up the degree to which kids are exposed to complicated stories. Instead, we're purifying the stories just like we're purifying their physical environments.
So to come back to the question of how things are going to come through this, on the one hand, it's great to hear that there's pushback in New York, in the New York schools and so on. But we're not really seeing any movement away from safetyism yet. In fact, in many ways, that's getting worse. There's more, as you just said, censorship of literature, more aversion to any kind of physical risk. So is there any sense that you're getting of parents starting to change their views of how to raise children?
Not much. So I would urge your listeners to go to letgrow.org. It's an organization. It's an organization co-founded by Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids, and me, and Peter Gray, who's a psychologist who studies play, and Daniel Schuchman, who was the chairman of the board of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And so we have there all kinds of research and activities to try to encourage parents to give their kids the kinds of freedom to play that they need and that all kids used to have. Now, in the United States, it's going to be very, very difficult for a couple of reasons. One is we have way too many lawyers. So if anybody takes a risk, so not so much a parent, but if any school administrator lets kids play and someone gets hurt, then they can get sued. And the other thing is we have very expensive healthcare. So something I was very impressed by, like in New Zealand, you have, what's the name of that school? There's a school that's very famous around the world, the No Rules School.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
where is it? Can you say the name of it? Or I can probably find
Actually,
it.
I know the school that you mean, but I can't remember its name. So,
Okay, yeah, there's a great video about it. So I would urge all your listeners to watch that. We'll put it in the we'll
yeah,
put it in the
we'll look
link
that
to
up
the yeah.
and link it. Yeah.
Yeah. But one of the things that I remember from watching the video is that because you have really good free healthcare in New Zealand, and because you have very few lawyers, if a kid gets hurt at recess, it's not going to bankrupt the family, and it's not going to lead to a lawsuit for the school.
That's
So
true.
the
Actually,
parents,
it's more than just not having many lawyers. There's actually a government-funded agency called the ACC, the Accident Compensation Commission, that compensates people for injuries, and you're not allowed to sue for
that yep,
that kind
that
of
is
injury.
so brilliant. That is so brilliant. So it's not just financially efficient, it's psychologically
Yeah.
efficient. Because in America, we're a nation of scaredy cats because we're not just afraid of getting hurt, we're afraid of lawsuits. And the fear of lawyers, the fear of being sued is crippling to most organizations, especially schools. So what I'm saying is things are beginning to turn around in the United States, but there are limits to what we can do because of our stupid legal system and healthcare system. New Zealand and Australia in particular, your countries really can lead on this. You're tougher than we are in a lot of ways. Also, your schools are not, your universities are not residential. The crazy, bizarre beliefs can't survive the light, the strength of daylight. So, on at Middlebury College or Harvard or, any place where you got a bunch of 18-year-olds living together, they can come up with these crazy beliefs like it's impact, not intent. Intent doesn't matter. What kind of human being could believe that the intent, if somebody bumps into you, it doesn't matter if they meant to or if it was an accident. I was hurt. Like, that's crazy. That doesn't survive contact with reality. But on an American college campus, there's very little contact with reality. On an Australian or New Zealand campus, university campus, I think it's the case that the students generally go home to their parents, or they don't live on campus for the most part. Is that right?
Some of them do. There are things called halls of residence, but they're nothing like American college fraternities and sororities. And a lot of students will live in shared accommodation, just houses that although that's becoming an issue because rents are so expensive, but a lot of them will live at home with their parents for purely economic reasons. I'm not convinced that's a good thing either. I think getting out of home and becoming an adult
there's that.
is quite important.
Yeah.
So I never lived residentially on a campus, but I lived in houses with other students, and we went from being utterly hopeless and complete slobs to being quite reasonable after a few years, and it was a very good experience.
No, that's right. That would be great, and that's what college used to be. Is you're pretty much on your own, and you're physically safe, and the building is taken care of, but you're pretty much on your own. And if somebody insults you, you wouldn't dream of like going to a dean to talk about it. But now on American college campuses, they're encouraged to report each other. If they overhear someone telling a joke that they disapprove of, they're encouraged to report the person anonymously. I think it'd be much better to have kids live at home because college campuses in America are so toxic. They do not make kids stronger and wiser. I think they just perpetuate kind of an infantilization, and they would prepare them for citizenship in the ideal Soviet Union, I think, but not in the the free United States or any Commonwealth country.
That's right. And it's actually this is one of the aspects I find the most depressing, because you look back at sort of Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain, and we used to tell ourselves the story. Well, of course, the Soviets came in and they installed these communist elites, and then everybody was scared. But there's more and more historical research that also suggests that in Nazi Germany and East Germany and places like that, a lot of citizens were actually, a good proportion of the citizenry were actually cooperating, because there's certain advantages to having these bureaucracies there. Because if you have any kind of little mission in your own personal life, you feel angry at someone, it's very convenient. You can pursue these things through the bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
But so what I find especially depressing, it's not anywhere as bad as that, of course. No one's being sent to the gulag.
Yeah, that's right.
It's important to bear in mind. But in some ways, we sort of self-generated a sort of soft version of this, right? That it's almost like we actually, there's a part of our human nature that sort of quite likes the idea that you can go and dob somebody in.
Yes, a lot of these things can be analyzed as social dilemmas where going along with something can be good for individuals. It can even be better for most individuals, but yet when we do it, everyone is on average worse off. And I think that's what we're seeing. And it's bad enough when it happens on a college campus. It damages our ability to find truth. There's a fantastic book out now by Jonathan Rauch, Rauch, called The Constitution of Knowledge. And it's about how it is that we ever get knowledge, and how the sort of the Western Enlightenment tradition created institutions like universities, later journalism, all sorts of things. Um, um, let's see, what was I saying? I just lost my train of thought, but it was going someplace good, I know.
Just to sort of further give you more to think about, I'm encouraged by the way that you look at Australia and New Zealand and see hope, and also I'm interested in the way that you see difference, because one of the things that struck me about this sort of wave of whatever you want to call it, extreme progressivism, wokeness, is that it seems to be a sort of what the French would call an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon. In other words, it's something that seems to be spreading especially quickly in Anglophone countries. So the fear I was born in Canada, I've been in New Zealand for 8 years now. So the fear for me is that it's something that's spread out of the United States, these particular conditions you're talking about, maybe in American liberal arts colleges. And because America has such a sort of preponderant weight within the Anglophone world, because of its population, its wealth, and it's, to be honest, its sort of traditional leadership role. You can see this very much as what the old left used to call American cultural imperialism, right? So what do you think about that? Is it an English-speaking thing? Is it eventually going to get to other parts of the world, or other prosperous parts of the world, like, I don't know, Germany? Is it something to do with the English language? Is it something to do with Protestant Christianity? What's going on there?
Yeah. So I do think, yes, it's definitely an Anglo thing. And if you'd asked me 2 or 3 years ago, I would say it's exclusively an Anglo thing. Now, I was in Sweden in 2017, and similar stuff was happening in Swedish universities, but they said it was brought in by American exchange students. We're seeing bits and pieces of this in European institutions. I was in Latin America. There wasn't much of this in Argentina, Chile. And there's been enormous populist uprisings around the world. There's a lot of political ferment, but often that's over really legitimate political concerns, and it's not couched in a language of safetyism, of emotional fragility. So until very recently, I would have said, yeah, it's exclusively an Anglo thing. But recently now we're seeing, there was just a big deal in France over the last few months. Macron started bashing American-style identity politics and wokeness. So all of our countries, including France, are universalist countries. That is, they're not based on ethnicity. When I was younger, I used to assume that France was based on being French, but no, the French since the Revolution have very much the idea that you're French if you buy into these revolutionary ideas and égalité, fraternité, liberté, so the French have gone a certain way about how do you create a multi-ethnic nation, which is saying we're all French. That's why we want to ban the hijab, which is a questionable thing. Anglo countries would never ban the hijab, but that's the French way of trying to create an ethnically mixed society. And the Anglo way has more individual liberties, civil liberties. The American Revolution was a really good revolution. The French Revolution was a really horrible revolution. We have we're much more. We have a bit more of Edmund Burke and in our intellectual heritage about the danger of massive revolutionary change and the wisdom of gradually improving our institutions. Something is happening in France. Now there they have different issues. It's more about Islam than it is about race, Black or African heritage. So it remains to be seen. But certainly the Anglo countries are not just joined at the hip. We have a lot in common, and we're subject to very much the same intellectual and ideological diseases. But I think we have an extraordinarily good intellectual heritage of liberalism and John Stuart Mill and the leadership in the scientific revolutions that once people start standing up, once university leaders, journalists, corporate leaders start standing up and affirming what it takes to have a liberal society, then I think that this problem will, if not be solved, I think the tide will turn. I was just on a call with Jonathan Rauch, and he said one of his principles is they're not 10 feet tall, we are. Meaning everyone's so afraid of these few, usually, young woke students or young woke employees. Everyone's so afraid of them, but they're not actually very powerful unless you let them be powerful. And that, in fact, we have an awful lot to be proud of, those of us who are in the institutions, what he calls the constitution of knowledge, the institutions that create knowledge, especially universities.
Yeah. I mean, I really hope you're right. I guess in my darker moments, I fear that, this fear that you're referring to is got so ingrained and so entrenched that we're not seeing any journalists or university leaders or even political leaders standing up.
Okay, so let me give a little pep talk here. Let me see. I'm actually trying to write something up here. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, I'll just sort of off the cuff give a little pep talk here.
Yeah, okay.
And let me say, look, because I've been through this. I had students, writing terrible articles about me in the newspaper because of a lecture I gave, where they took one line in the worst possible way, and it was horrible. And I was shamed, and I couldn't sleep at night, and it was the worst thing that ever happened to me in my academic life. That is. And then various other things that happened to me running Heterodox Academy, and sometimes I've backed down and I've been intimidated, and finally things have just gone so far, and various things happened last year that I just resolved. You know what? I'm not gonna bow down anymore.
Yeah.
And the reason why all I'm saying is I'm not speaking from the point of view of somebody who's been courageous consistently. I sometimes have been cowardly. And what I can tell you is this. In the moment, for those listening who either have faced or will face a moment in which it seems like their world is being torn up, people are accusing them of something, they might lose their job. These things blow up amazingly quickly. It can happen in a matter of a day or two. Crazy stuff in America, like somebody's photographed making the OK symbol, and they're fired because that is taken as a white power symbol. It's crazy stuff like that. And so at the moment, it seems overwhelming. It seems the world is against you, and it seems that you're done for. But the minority of people who have stood up and said, no, that's not what I was doing. The minority of people who've stood up for themselves, or especially had people stand up for them, if you just wait a week, the circus moves on somewhere else. And the people who didn't bow down, the people who didn't bend a knee, are heroes.
You're right.
So slow things down, stick to your principles, know that it'll be hard for a few days or weeks, but if you bend to it, you'll be ashamed for the rest of your life. And if you stand up to it, especially in a way with dignity and moderation and decency, if you stand up to it, people will respect you far more. They won't say it publicly, at least not at first, but privately, you'll hear from a lot of people who admire what you've done.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really, really good advice. And it always just makes me feel so depressed when some, public figure is shamed, and the first thing they do is abjectly apologize. And I think that is, I mean, not only are you sacrificing your dignity and your principles, it's also ineffective. It's a surefire way to just continue the pile on. And
exactly.
So I kind of wonder why
there's
people
research,
do it, because once you get to that point, there seems to be no hope. Whereas those few who have actually stuck to their guns have come through as a rule. I think there's a great wisdom in what you're saying there.
There's a collective action aspect to this as well. I mean, I think there was a thing in classics where a lecturer said something like, well, Caesar killed a lot of people in Gaul, but then there was more stability afterwards. and a student wrote online, this is just literally justifying genocide. And then later on, this group apologized, and I
Oh
stuck up for
God.
them, and I sort of thought, well, that then sort of sells out the people who stuck up for you, because then it makes their defense seem more anomalous, right? Whereas that should be the norm of just saying, well, come on, he's
That's
just
right.
discussing history.
Exactly. That's right. So just to build into what you're both saying, there is a really powerful urge to confess and to apologize. And as a psychologist, I'm really interested when I see a kind of a complex pattern repeating itself across history and across countries. It's really interesting to me. So I have a whole file of notes in my Evernote system. The title is Maoist Apology File, because there was a formula to a Maoist apology, and it always ended by apologizing for the harm that you've done and vowing to do better. That's the basic part of the structure, and it's really funny. Yeah, let me just see if I have any that really stand out here. But there's oh yeah, okay, yeah. The dean of a university apologizes to a Twitter mob after he congratulated the Republican nominee for winning an election, and he writes to the whole university community, "I'd like to apologize to anyone offended by my tweet. It was ill-timed and poorly written. I've read and learned so much from you all, and will endeavor to be more thoughtful." Okay, that's not as groveling as a lot of them get, but there's a real structure to it, and you'll see this if you look at the apologies, the ritual apologies, and there's research by Cass Sunstein and others showing that it doesn't even help you, that it doesn't appease them or bring them in. People won't bring you back into their good graces because there's no forgiveness in the woke religion. There is no forgiveness.
Yeah, that lack of redemptive mechanism. Actually, there was an event in New Zealand a couple of days ago that was both dismal and kind of darkly amusing. It was a student group called something like School Strike for Climate Justice or something along those lines. It was a climate change activist group that encouraged kids to skip school and protest against lack of action on climate change. And they issued a self-cancellation notice saying that they realized that they were a white supremacist organization, and they hadn't foregrounded Indigenous voices enough, and so they did this utterly spontaneously, as far as I could tell. There was no event that led to them, but they did issue that sort of Maoist apology unprompted, and they cancelled their organization and discouraged the formation of any successor group that would be led by white people. It occurred to both James and I independently that this is the death of parody, because you couldn't, if that isn't parody, then what could be?
Oh, I've got a whole file of other stuff that's just absurd. But yes, but that for those listeners who saw the Beatles movie, The Yellow Submarine, there's that famous scene where the vacuum cleaner is sucking everything up, and eventually it sucks up itself and vanishes.
Right, yes.
So that is, but I think, that also raises a larger point, especially because what we're I mean, I don't know your politics, but most of this is a battle within the left, and it basically I mean, there are people from the right who are fighting against this, often in ways that I think are not necessarily productive or helpful. But for the most part, this is a battle within the left between what I would call the liberal left versus the illiberal or woke left. And as any civil war, it weakens both sides. And especially if you talk to people in any progressive organization, I've talked to many people leading nonprofit organizations in education, in the arts, in social justice. And if they're over 30, well, the leaders are almost always over 30. If you talk to the leader and you say, "How's it going? How are things these days?" Or sometimes I'll ask, "How are your Gen Z employees? I know you must have some young people. How's it going?" It's the exact same conversation over and over again. They say, "Oh my God." Now, let me say this in private. "Oh my God." It's like every day it's just conflict because somebody said something that somebody objected to. And then we go around and around, and the whole organization has to get involved every day. And so the self-cancellation example you gave is just exactly the sort of thing that I'm hearing. The larger point here is that, especially if you're on the left and listening to this podcast, bear in mind that wokeness is really damaging left-wing organizations within and left-wing credibility in elections. Most people hate wokeness and candidates that come out with that stuff tend to lose. So if you actually care about progressive concerns, if you want to reduce racism and bring in politicians who will care about social class and help the working class, if you want any sort of progressive political progress, you should be very concerned and do what you can to help the left get over this.
I mean,
And we should also say, go ahead.
I was just going to say, politics in the United Kingdom is very much a testament to what you're saying, that the state of the British Labour Party is almost certainly brought about by an abandonment of the sort of traditional working class in favour of these woke ideas.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. And let's also be clear that there is a different dynamic playing out on the right. It's not wokeness, but there is right-wing populism that in the United States has brought the right, the Republican Party, off the planet into bizarre outer space land. And a lot of it has to do with intimidation there too, because if you challenge, if you say, as some Republicans did, you know what, Donald Trump lost. We've looked into it. There've been court cases. Donald Trump. If you say that, your family could be in danger for some politicians. Many of them have confessed that in private that they're afraid to stand up for what's obviously true and correct about the election because of all the threats. Again, facilitated by social media and this religion. That is, the MAGA, or Make America Great religion. So this is not so. So crazy moral extremism is damaging both the right and the left. But the three of us are in the academic world where there's not much representation of the right. So for us, it's a problem within the left, and it's one that I think we have to solve for the good of universities and for the good of our societies. And I think it is a problem that we will solve. Bill Clinton once said, "There's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right about it." And I would say the same thing about universities. There's nothing wrong with universities that can't be fixed by what's right about them. So if we can do good, impartial social science research, we live in a fascinating time. It's scary as hell, but it is fascinating. And if we do good research on this, we can figure out what's going on. Fads, crazes, they do pass. And so our job, and this is part of what we're doing in Heterodox Academy, and thank you both so much for joining, we're trying to speed that up. We're trying to do the research, publicize the ideas, critique the bad ideas gently and with evidence.
Yeah.
And I just got a text from my wife telling me I have to go home now. So actually, maybe this is a good place to leave our conversation.
Indeed.
Let me just end by saying, especially if you are at a university, if you're a stakeholder in a university, primarily a professor, but also an administrator or a graduate student or something like that, please go to heterodoxacademy.org and join us. We're completely nonpartisan. My own preference is to really unmoralize things, strip out the morality, strip out the judgment, just try to figure out what's going on, can we make it better? And that's what we're trying to do. And it's actually very exciting.
Yes, we'll certainly put a link to the Heterodox Academy on the podcast as well. And look, thank you so much for joining us today, John. It's been a wonderful conversation, and look, all the very best with your continuing endeavours. I think what we're doing is actually building our own resilience as well. To hark back to those ideas in the coddling of the American mind, that actually, living through these difficult times and having to face up to them and having to find our courage is no bad thing for us spiritually and psychologically. So,
yeah, that's right. But if we all support each other, I think we can do it.
Yeah.
So, Michael and James, it's wonderful to see you again after, I guess it was 2 years ago when we met.
It must be 2
wonderful
years.
to see what you're building in New Zealand. I look forward to future conversations.
Thanks
a lot, John.
Take
Cheers.
care.